The crystal chandelier shook, then it fell. Glass shattered across the marble floor of the grand ballroom. 500 guests froze in their seats. At the center of the room, 70-year-old Thomas Hale stood motionless, his face drained of color. Moments earlier he had been smiling, toast in hand, a conqueror enjoying applause. Now the wineglass lay broken at his feet. A shard of crystal had cut his palm. Blood dripped onto the white tablecloth. He did not notice. His eyes were locked on one man. "Margaret?" His voice cracked, dry, unsteady. "No, that's not possible." He shook his head. "She was supposed to be nothing. I left her with nothing." No one spoke. The silence pressed down harder than any funeral. In that moment, Thomas Hale understood something too late. The woman he had discarded was not gone. She was standing behind the collapse of everything he believed he owned. But this story did not begin in a ballroom. It began quietly, 2 years earlier, at a small, prestigious French restaurant in Boston. Margaret Hale was 66 that evening. She wore a navy silk dress. Simple, elegant. A vintage brooch rested at her collarbone. It had belonged to her aunt. She had chosen it carefully. It was their 36th wedding anniversary. She expected a celebration. Outside, twilight reflected off the Charles River. Inside, the restaurant smelled of butter, wine, and polished wood. Across the table, Thomas was not present. His attention was buried in his phone. Blue light reflected off his glasses. He had not looked at her once since they sat down. "Thomas," Margaret said. Her voice was calm, controlled. "The wine is excellent, don't you think?" He did not look up. He grunted. His thumb kept scrolling. "Claire says the merger numbers are in," he replied. "She understands the pressure I'm under. She doesn't just sit there." The name was deliberate. Claire, his secretary, 25 years younger. Margaret felt the shift immediately. Not shock, not surprise. Clarity. For 30 years, she had built his life without standing in the light. She curated his image, edited his speeches, managed the relationships that allowed him to rise. She'd given up her own career as a heritage consultant so his name could appear in headlines. "I am leaving you, Margaret," Thomas said. He finally looked at her. There was no anger, no regret, only calculation. "I need someone who matches my energy," he continued. "Someone who belongs in the world I've built. You're comfortable, but you're stagnant, a relic of my past." Margaret did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She watched him straighten his tie. She noticed how he already looked past her, toward a future he believed she could not enter. "I see," she said. That was all. Thomas blinked, disappointed. "The lawyers prepared everything," he added. "You'll get the suburban house, a pension. It's generous for someone who hasn't worked in decades." Margaret looked at him closely. For the first time in years, she saw him clearly. Not a visionary, not a builder. A man who believed ownership came from volume, not substance. He saw her as something functional, replaceable, used up. Poor Margaret. That was how he would describe her. And in that moment, Margaret Hale made a decision. She would not argue. She would not negotiate. She would not fight for his collapsing empire or beg for a larger share of his debt. She would disappear because Thomas Hale had forgotten one crucial fact. Margaret was a curator of history, and she knew exactly how to bury a man who believed he was a king. Success is rarely built by one person alone. Thomas Hale believed his was. To the public, Thomas Hale was a visionary, a financial strategist, a man praised for instincts sharp enough to turn risk into profit. What no one saw was the structure behind him. That structure was Margaret Hale. Margaret had learned early how to recognize real value. In her 30s, she was already respected in cultural preservation, working with estates, archives, and historic properties. Her world rewarded patience, accuracy, and long memory, not noise. When she married Thomas, she brought more than loyalty. She brought credibility and strategy. Thomas noticed the difference immediately. Meetings went more smoothly. Donors stayed longer. Investors trusted him faster when Margaret sat beside him. At first, they worked as partners. Then Thomas began asking for adjustments, then for sacrifices. Just for a little while, he told her one night as she reviewed restoration plans spread across her desk, "Help me get established. Once I'm secure, you can return to your work." Margaret believed him. A few years passed, then 10, then 30. Margaret became invisible without disappearing. She declined invitations under her own name. She let Thomas take credit for work she shaped. She learned which investors needed reassurance and which needed silence. Thomas spoke confidently. Margaret edited quietly. Thomas promised outcomes. Margaret verified details. As Thomas's reputation grew, his dependence on Margaret became habit. He no longer asked for her judgment. He expected it. Assumption replaced gratitude. In their 60s, the language shifted. Thomas stopped saying we. He said, "My firm, my success, my future." Margaret was reduced to logistics, social scheduling, gift selection, damage control. "The Peterson Gala is Thursday," Thomas said one evening, loosening his tie. "Make sure the gift is right. And don't bring up your old manuscripts. People find that sort of thing tedious." He laughed. Margaret did not. She noticed patterns Thomas ignored: late nights, sloppier contracts, deals signed without review, loans structured on optimism rather than security. She corrected them, quietly. Then came Claire Bennett, the secretary, younger, attractive, efficient. Claire admired Thomas openly. She laughed easily. She never questioned his numbers or his judgment. Thomas mistook admiration for competence. Margaret did not. Claire saw a confident leader. She did not see the man who froze when markets shifted, or the one who relied on Margaret to explain his own exposure. Margaret had always steadied him. In the months before the divorce, Thomas rewrote their history. He told friends he had built everything alone. He implied Margaret had followed, not contributed. A comfortable wife, a dependent presence. The story pleased him. It made his choices feel justified. After the papers were served, Margaret walked through the house one last time. She touched books she had selected, art she had chosen, rooms she had arranged to impress people Thomas no longer remembered. She saw what he never had: the cracks, unsecured loans layered beneath shell companies, risks disguised as confidence. Thomas believed removing her was freedom. It was exposure. Silence unsettles people who are used to being heard. Thomas Hale expected noise. He expected anger. Accusations. Lawyers calling at all hours. Public embarrassment that he could point to and label as bitterness. He prepared for a fight. Margaret gave him nothing. She signed the divorce papers without hesitation. She did not argue over assets. She did not question the alimony. She thanked the attorney politely and left. The absence of resistance confused Thomas more than rage ever could. He waited for late-night messages, for emotional phone calls, for mutual friends to take sides. Nothing came. When Thomas returned to the house after her final move-out, the silence felt wrong, not empty, final. Margaret had removed her belongings in 3 afternoons. No scenes, no witnesses, no traces of grievance. Thomas poured himself a drink and sat in his chair, expecting the house to accuse him. It did not. That unsettled him. "She's just stunned," Claire said later, her voice smooth with certainty. "She'll realize soon enough she's nothing without your name." Thomas accepted that explanation because he needed it to be true. He needed Margaret to be diminished somewhere out of sight. But Margaret was not hiding. She was driving north. She left Boston before dawn, the city still quiet. No calls, no music, just the road and the sound of tires moving forward. Her destination was Gray Harbor, Maine. It was not a retreat. It was a return. Margaret had spent childhood summers there, in a town shaped by stone and weather. It was where her aunt, Evelyn Gray, had lived. Evelyn had died 6 months earlier. She had also prepared. Evelyn was not sentimental. She was strategic. She understood ownership, leverage, and timing. From the moment she met Thomas Hale, she had distrusted him. "That man is hollow," Evelyn once told Margaret. "He makes noise, not substance. Don't let him empty you." Margaret had not listened. Evelyn had planned anyway. The house in Gray Harbor stood on a cliff above the Atlantic, a gray Victorian, weathered and firm. It did not impress by design. It endured. Evelyn had not left Margaret a house. She had left her a trust, a large, layered trust holding land, maritime assets, and preservation projects across New England. Quiet assets, old assets, protected assets. There was one condition: Margaret would manage it, and she would not announce its reach. "Real power does not advertise," Evelyn had written. "It waits." Standing on the porch, the wind cutting cold across her face, Margaret felt something she had not felt in decades: control. She was no longer an abandoned wife. She was not recovering. She was assuming responsibility. Margaret made a deliberate choice. She would not confront Thomas. She would not expose him. She would not correct his misunderstanding. She would let him continue believing in his version of reality. Because Thomas Hale did not collapse under pressure. He collapsed under certainty. Margaret turned toward the house and closed the door behind her. Disappearing was not retreat. It was positioning. Gray Harbor moved at a different pace. Time there was measured by tide charts and weather shifts, not deadlines or quarterly earnings. Margaret adapted quickly. She rose early. She walked the shoreline before the town woke. She learned the rhythm of the harbor, the schedules of the fishermen, the quiet hierarchy of a place that valued discretion over display. No one asked who she used to be. They cared only about what she respected. Margaret spent her mornings at the local historical society. Records were disorganized, deeds misfiled, archives neglected. She corrected them, methodically. In the afternoons, she worked remotely as a consultant. Preservation boards, land trusts, private foundations. Work she had once done quietly under Thomas's name now arrived directly to her. She did not advertise. She delivered. Within a year, the initials M. Hale began appearing on approvals that mattered. Not public announcements, quiet authorizations, decisions that redirected funding and altered outcomes. Margaret preferred it that way. Back in Boston, Margaret Hale no longer existed. Thomas had erased her completely. At social events, if her name surfaced, he responded with indulgent dismissal. "She always preferred the past," he would say. "Maine suits her. She does hobby work now." People nodded. No one asked further. Thomas had remarried quickly. He and Claire moved into a glass and steel penthouse overlooking the river. The space reflected light but held no weight. The lifestyle was expensive. Thomas compensated by increasing risk. Projects grew larger. Timelines tightened. Margins stretched. The discipline Margaret once enforced was gone. She was no longer there to question assumptions. One of Thomas's firms submitted a proposal for a coastal restoration project in Massachusetts. It was rejected. The board's written assessment was brief. Lacking depth, short-term focused, insufficient respect for historical continuity. Thomas was irritated but unconcerned. He never asked who had written the assessment. Margaret had. She read the proposal. She recognized his language, the ambition, the shortcuts. She signed the rejection with a neutral hand, not out of spite, out of accuracy. Margaret learned something important that year. Power did not require visibility. It required placement. She could decline Thomas's work without him knowing she existed. She could redirect funds without appearing in the room. That was real authority. One evening, while reviewing trust holdings, Margaret noticed a familiar name: a bridge loan. It had once been extended quietly by her aunt to a private equity group. That group had since been absorbed by a larger entity. That entity was financing Thomas's newest development. Margaret understood the implication immediately. If the terms shifted, Thomas's project would stall. If audits were enforced, his guarantees would surface. Her hand paused over the phone. She did not make the call. "Not yet," she said aloud, because Thomas was still convinced he was winning. And men like Thomas only collapse when they believe the ground beneath them is solid. The invitation arrived 3 weeks later, a cream envelope, gold embossing. Thomas Hale and Claire Bennett. Wedding celebration? Berkshires. Margaret noticed the venue immediately. It belonged to the trust. She set the invitation down carefully. Thomas was preparing to celebrate his future on land he did not know was already hers. The wedding was designed to be proof that Thomas Hale was still winning. At 70, he intended the ceremony to function as a declaration. He was successful, desired, untouched by age or loss. Nothing about it was modest. Every decision announced excess. The Berkshires estate, the guest list, the imported florals, the orchestra flown in from New York. Thomas wanted witnesses. Behind the display, the numbers were failing. Thomas sat alone in his office late at night, staring at spreadsheets that no longer resolved. To finance the wedding, the penthouse, and Claire's expectations, he had layered credit upon credit. Short-term loans, personal guarantees, optimistic assumptions. He told himself the development project would cover it. It had to. Claire reinforced the urgency. "Appearances matter," she said, reviewing guest arrangements. "If people see stability, they invest. We can't look hesitant." She believed confidence created reality. Margaret had always known it did not. The problems surfaced first at the venue. Requests were denied. No additional structures, no fireworks, no alterations to protected land. Thomas reacted with irritation, not concern. He was accustomed to exceptions. His attorneys pushed back. The trust did not bend. "It's a blind trust," his lawyer explained. "Managed out of Maine. They follow rules." Maine. The word lingered longer than it should have. Thomas dismissed the unease. Rules could be navigated later. The larger threat arrived quietly. One of his primary investors withdrew. No press release, no explanation. Just a brief notice stating capital was being redirected toward more stable assets. Thomas reread the message several times. Without that funding, his exposure widened. Personal assets were now directly linked. He did not share this with Claire. He could not afford uncertainty to spread. Meanwhile, in Gray Harbor, Margaret reviewed quarterly trust summaries. One line item held her attention: a bridge loan. Its ownership had changed hands. The acquiring entity was now underwriting Thomas's development. Margaret closed the file slowly. She understood what Thomas did not. The safety net beneath him had been absorbed. If conditions tightened, his structure would fail. Her phone remained on the table. She did not touch it. "Not yet," she said again. Because Thomas still believed momentum protected him. Men like Thomas only recognize collapse when the audience is present. The invitation arrived shortly after. Cream stock, gold lettering, a declaration of triumph. Margaret recognized the estate immediately. It belonged to the trust. She placed the invitation aside. The pedestal was already cracked. Thomas was simply climbing higher. The Berkshires looked flawless. Pine air, clear sky, white tents rising across manicured lawns. From a distance, everything suggested stability. Thomas Hale needed that illusion. He stood on the balcony of his suite, watching staff move with rehearsed precision. Tables aligned, chairs counted, florals adjusted. It looked controlled. Inside his phone, it was not. Missed calls, cautious messages, short confirmations where enthusiasm once lived. Claire joined him, wrapped in silk, champagne already in hand. "Everyone who matters is here," she said. "This weekend changes everything." Thomas nodded. He did not trust his voice. He told himself nerves were normal. He told himself momentum still worked. That afternoon, a black town car pulled into the inn across the valley. Thomas noticed it because it did not belong. The door opened. A woman stepped out. Her posture was familiar. Too familiar. For a moment, his breath stalled. Margaret. The name formed without sound. He shook the thought away. She would not be here. She could not afford to be here. Stress had begun inventing things. "Are you all right?" Claire asked. "You look pale." "Altitude," Thomas said. The lie came easily. The rehearsal dinner that evening was loud. Laughter filled the room. Glasses clinked. Compliments circulated. Thomas moved from group to group, smiling too long, laughing too quickly. He pitched. He reassured. He avoided specifics. The room sensed it. Wealth always does. Near the edge of the hall, a cluster of senior financiers spoke quietly. "Did you hear about the Hale debt?" "Which one?" "The Maine Trust. They acquired primary exposure." Thomas passed close enough to hear fragments. His stomach tightened. Hale. Maine. The words did not fit together. He did not have a trust in Maine. Margaret did not have money. He repeated that to himself until it felt thin. Across the valley, Margaret dined quietly at the inn. The trustees were seated with her, men and women who valued restraint. They discussed land use, preservation strategy, long-term holdings. No one mentioned the wedding. It did not require comment. Later, the Trust's counsel leaned closer. "Mr. Hale listed his personal residence as collateral for event insurance," he said. "The penthouse." Margaret paused. She understood immediately. Thomas was financing celebration with borrowed certainty. "And since we now underwrite that insurer," the attorney continued, "the credit extends from us." Margaret set down her glass. "Keep it quiet," she said. "Tonight belongs to him." The counsel nodded. Margaret looked toward the darkened lawn beyond the windows. Thomas believed he was standing on solid ground. By morning, he would learn how little stood beneath him. The wedding day arrived clear and bright. The lake reflected the sky. White fabric moved gently in the breeze. Everything looked intentional. Thomas Hale stood at the altar in a tailored tuxedo, smiling for cameras. Beside him, Claire Bennett looked flawless, youthful, certain. Applause followed them down the aisle. The ceremony ended. The reception began. Music swelled. Glasses were filled. Lobster was served. For brief angufourie. Thomas believed he had succeeded. He moved through the ballroom, greeting guests, securing promises, laughing loudly enough to sound relaxed. Then the doors opened. The man who entered did not hesitate. He wore a dark suit. No badge, no smile. He did not look lost. He walked directly toward the head table. Thomas felt irritation before recognition. "Who is that?" he muttered to Claire. "I don't know," she said, tightening her grip on her bouquet. The man stopped at the table. "Mr. Hale," he said calmly. "Arthur Henderson, counsel for the Gray Harbor Trust." The name settled heavily across the table. Nearby conversations stopped. "This is a private event," Thomas said sharply. "Whatever this is can wait." "I'm afraid it cannot," Henderson replied. "Your primary investor withdrew this morning. That required an immediate audit of all collateral supporting today's event." The room stilled. Thomas felt heat rise to his face. "I don't know who you think you represent," he said. "You have no authority here." Henderson met his eyes. "Your former wife does," he said. "Margaret Hale is the managing director of the trust underwriting this estate." The words struck like fracture. Thomas stared. "That's impossible," he said. "She has nothing. I left her with nothing." A banker at the adjacent table stood. "You mean Margaret Hale of the Gray Harbor Trust?" he asked. "The preservation fund that assumed Berkshire development debt last quarter?" Henderson nodded. "She has overseen its expansion for 2 years," he said. Quietly. The room erupted in whispers. Thomas's voice rose, uncontrolled. "She's a librarian," he shouted. "A dependent. She lived off my name." Henderson's tone did not change. "Mr. Hale," he said, "you lived off her judgment. She simply stopped providing it." Thomas turned. Across the ballroom, on the balcony, Margaret stood. She wore a dark green suit. Simple, intentional. She did not smile. She did not move. She observed. Thomas reached toward her, fingers shaking. "Come down here," he shouted. "Face me." Margaret remained still. After a moment she turned and walked away. The silence that followed was absolute. The silence did not break. It spread. What followed was not chaos. It was distance. Chairs shifted. Guests avoided eye contact. Conversations ended without conclusion. Thomas felt it immediately. The room was no longer with him. "You're lying," Thomas said, his voice sharp and thin. "This is retaliation. She's bitter." No one responded. Arthur Henderson did not raise his voice. "Mr. Hale," he said, "this is not a personal matter. The trust has assumed legal control of the estate's obligations. The reception is concluded." Claire stepped forward, panic breaking through her composure. "Thomas, fix this," she said. "Tell them they're wrong." Thomas turned on her. "There is nothing to fix," he shouted. "They're all gone." The admission startled even him. Security moved in quietly, not urgently, not aggressively, firmly. Thomas pointed toward the balcony. "She planned this," he yelled. "She ruined me." Henderson's reply was even. "She did not ruin you," he said. "She stopped protecting you." That sentence landed heavier than accusation. Thomas lunged forward. He did not reach anyone. The guards held him back. From the corridor beyond the ballroom, Claire's sobs echoed as she retreated toward the suite. Henderson addressed the room. "Guests are requested to depart. The trust will take possession of outstanding vendor arrangements." The exodus was swift. Champagne glasses were abandoned, plates left half-finished. Conversations ended mid-sentence. Thomas watched people leave who had shaken his hand minutes earlier. No one said goodbye. The ballroom emptied. Thomas sat alone at the head table. His jacket lay on the floor. His tie loosened. He stared at the wedding cake. 5 tiers. White. Perfect. Untouched. He saw himself reflected faintly in the polished silver. An old man. A man who believed volume was strength. He had mistaken applause for foundation. The lion had not been defeated. It had been exposed. And exposure is irreversible. Collapse does not echo. It settles. In the days following the wedding, Thomas Hale's world dismantled itself with precision. There were no confrontations, no dramatic statements, just notices. His firm filed for bankruptcy within 48 hours. Accounts were frozen, contracts voided, partners withdrew without explanation. The penthouse was seized, furniture cataloged, art removed. Thomas relocated to a narrow apartment on the edge of the city, the kind of place designed for transients. Claire remained for 3 weeks. She packed slowly at first, then efficiently. "I didn't sign up for this," she said, closing a suitcase. "You said you were untouchable." Thomas did not respond. She left without ceremony. Silence returned. Thomas filled it poorly. He drank. He scrolled. He searched Margaret's name until the screen blurred. Photos surfaced. Margaret at fundraisers. Margaret beside governors. Margaret speaking calmly to rooms that listened. She looked unchanged. He looked erased. Margaret did not contact him. No messages, no demands. She treated him as concluded. One afternoon, Thomas drove north. He reached Gray Harbor by evening. He parked at the edge of the long driveway and waited. He rehearsed accusations. He prepared apologies. Margaret stepped onto the porch carrying tea. She looked at the ocean. She did not look for him. Thomas saw his reflection in the mirror. He looked diminished. If he approached, she would not argue. She would ask him to leave. The thought stopped him. He turned the car around. The ocean continued without him. Thomas returned to his apartment, to the quiet he had feared, and now deserved. Gray Harbor never rushed. The ocean moved when it was ready. Margaret Hale stood on the porch as the sun lowered toward the horizon. Light stretched across the water, steady and unhurried. It had been a year since the wedding. The world had continued. Margaret had not hidden after that day. She had stepped forward deliberately, not loudly. Boards invited her to lead. Foundations sought her judgment. Young professionals asked for her counsel. She accepted selectively. She traveled often. She restored coastlines. She protected land that others would have traded for headlines. When asked about her success, she corrected the timeline. "It wasn't sudden," she said. "It was accumulated." Margaret no longer worked behind anyone's name. Her name stood alone. She heard about Thomas occasionally. Florida, contract work, temporary roles, nothing stable, nothing lasting. She did not comment. She did not need distance to heal. She had clarity. The orchids near the house were in bloom. Delicate, persistent, unremarkable to those who did not know how rare they were. The balance favored her. Power, she had learned, did not announce itself. It sustained. As the light faded, Margaret stepped inside. The door closed softly behind her. The silence that followed was not absence. It was ownership.